So we are live.
Oh, I need mic or what?
No, not required, sir. Here it is.
Oh,
there,
okay.
sir.
So इसमें clean करो.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So questions will appear in this chat window, sir. So for that you have to respond. So you can introduce yourself, sir. So that
Hello, I am Dr. Deep Mukherjee from IIT-Kanpur and welcome you all to the live session, the first live session on the course Microeconomics Theory and Applications. I am available to take questions from you now.
three you are watching, sir. Here there is an indication over there below the video, and questions will be posted.
Please post questions if you have some.
So just start. So students are able to join. So let's wait for some time. So, please. So do this one. So you can watch the event. Oh, no, that's a video.
Okay, so Murali.
Yes, sir. What is the preference?
So how can I answer
You
this?
wanted to write, sir, or orally you wanted to?
I can write.
Okay, right, sir. So we need to share our screen, sir. So screen share. Yes. We are watching. So use it here. Somebody has asked what is the preference. So size writing. Right, if you want to demonstrate, I think you can. Okay. The due date is over. Due date is still over. Okay, but the due date is over now. Due date is over. We can check the background the US filtering. But 15 seconds lag. So one of the questions was 15 seconds only to here. Even so orally, if you want to, no, okay, fine. So, ten are watching, sir, but they had to pose their questions. Students have to utilize these sessions, but they are not utilizing these sessions. Okay, inform us what I want. So, okay. So you want to respond orally?
Yeah, these I can't
Yes.
write.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, so we got a question. What is the difference between price and value? Now, price and value are two different things. Actually, there is a big philosophical debate about this distinction between price and value of a commodity. So, value of any commodity is basically the intrinsic value. So, it does not care how much price of that commodity is there in the market for this. So, you can think about the example of, okay, let me give you an example. There is a very famous paradox called diamond water paradox. Now we all know that the water is more useful than the diamond, but the diamond is much higher price than the water. In fact, earlier days water was not priced as well. Nowadays we see priced water, but even then the price of water is so less. So basically, this is a very nice paradox which talking about this distinction between value and price. Now, when we say value, value is basically the intrinsic value, that is the use value of a particular commodity. But price is basically set at the intersection of the demand and supply curves in the market, and it depends on the scarcity. Right. So for all the scarce resources, we see very high price, but it does not mean that their use value is much higher than a commodity for which we observe low price. I hope that will help you to understand the distinction between value and price. Okay, so we got another question, that why don't we take negative sign in MRS while solving questions? uh, I don't know. I mean, what to say? This is a convention. So we make a distinction between the slope of the isoquant and the indifference curves and the absolute values of them, and we give them names. In many textbooks, you will see that they don't differentiate between this absolute value and the absolute value of the slope and the original value of the slope. There, they deal with the negative sign. It is basically for a mathematical simplicity. It is sometimes hard for students to deal with negative numbers, because then if there are comparisons to be made in terms of inequalities and all, life becomes complicated. So just for mathematical ease, we are assuming the absolute value, that's it. But I'm again saying that this is just convention. There is no theoretical logic or anything behind it. So we got another question. Relative income hypothesis. I don't think we have discussed this thing in this course. Is this relevant question? I mean, please make sure that you ask questions, which, we have been discussing in this course so far. Please can't ask me questions on macroeconomics or development economics. Or if you are not expressing it properly, you can rewrite the question again and post. I am expecting more questions. So here we got one more. How are economic problems are resolved in various economic systems? I don't understand the question at all. I mean, this can lead to a very lengthy discussion. Why don't you ask me a very specific question? Okay, so we got another question. Why we mostly use Lagrangian functions? Well, uh, so Lagrangian technique is basically a mathematical tool which helps us to find solutions for constrained optimization problems, right? So that's why Lagrangian is used. Now, if you think about our consumer's utility maximization problem, the consumer tries to maximize his or her utility with respect to a budget constraint. And we have seen how we can solve this problem graphically. But graphically, when we try to solve a problem, it has to be a two-dimensional, maximum three-dimensional, right? So if I give you a problem, some utility function involving 4 or 5 goods, then what will you do? You can't draw graphs anymore. So in that cases, basically Lagrangian becomes indispensable because this is the only way to find out solution to an optimization problem involving more than 2 or 3 decision variables. I hope it is clear to you now. Okay, more questions, please. So here comes another question. How to draw indifference curve from Subhash? So let me answer this first. We have got another question from Shivam. I will come to you later. Let me first address Subhash's question. Subhash, you have to listen to the lectures carefully. I have already discussed this in details. I forgot the actual lecture number, but there is a lecture titled on indifference curve analysis. So if you listen, that the answer is there. But anyway, let me try to give you some hint. So basically, we have to work with the consumption plane, right? So you assume that your consumer consumes two goods, X and Y, and basically when you make different bundles of these two consumption goods, you can plot them in a Cartesian plane, right? This xy axis plane basically. And then suppose you start with one original bundle A, say, and then you make four quadrants around that point, or in the consumption bundle A, and then you try to figure out your indifference curve will pass through which quadrant and it will not pass through which quadrants. So that explanation has been given in very detail in the lecture. So please listen to the lecture. Now I move to Shivam's question. So how do we solve the economic problems in various economic system? I still don't understand. This question is not relevant to the course, because when we talk about economic systems, then basically talk about macroeconomics, right? Mostly. I mean, you have to be very specific here. Either you are asking how consumers choose their consumption bundles, or how farms choose inputs to produce output so that they can maximize profit. You have to ask, a specific question, Shivam. I can't answer this. This is vague. Okay, so we got another question from Umang. How to remember Slutsky versus Hick's price effect decomposition? See, this is a nice question, and I know that many students suffer in the price decomposition effects, especially they have difficulty to remember the difference between Hicks and Slutsky. So in the case of Hicks, remember simply that we are bringing back the consumer to the original utility level at which he or she started before the price change. And in the case of Slutsky, we are bringing back the consumer to the original consumption bundle which he or she was consuming earlier. So if you remember these 2 points, I think you will be able to draw the Hicksian and Slutsky substitution effects clearly. I hope this is it. And if you have more questions, you can ask. Please ask me about some concepts. If you are not confident about any particular concept, I can try to explain it again. Okay, here we got another question. Why can't indifference curve touch axis? So indifference curves cannot touch axis except for a special case of quasi-linear utility function, because one of the axioms is going to be violated if it touches axis. And there is a problem also. Suppose the indifference curve is derived from a multiplicative utility function, say in assignment questions or elsewhere you will find the use of these Cobb-Douglas type utility functions, right? So here if you make one particular consumption good 0, because if your indifference curve touches, then definitely one particular goods consumption is 0. And if that happens, then your utility will become 0 as well, because you are working with a multiplicative form of utility function. So we don't want to get into this kind of trouble, and hence quite straightforward manner we can assume for simplicity that your indifference curve does not touch axis. So basically we are talking about positive levels of consumption for both goods. But there are special cases like this quasi-linear utility function that we have seen. Then there can be perfect substitutes also, where you see the straight line indifference curves emerge. But these are special cases. These are not normal cases. More questions, please. Here we go. Why two indifference curves cannot intersect each other? What will happen if they intersect each other? So that's an assignment question, right? have you have you tried it? Okay, so if not, the answer is posted for this question, right? So why don't you go back and check the answer given, because then we can save some time and give space for other questions for others, because the answer has already been posted. Here we got another question. Why we purchase only one good in perfect substitute case? I see. Okay. So here we have this linear indifference curve, which is anyway a very special case, right? Now, here, how to find consumer equilibrium? That's very tricky, actually. We have to remember that we are looking for a consumer equilibrium point, but in this case there can be three different cases. So the budget constraint, the budget line is a straight line with the slope p1 over p2, that's basically the price ratio, and the indifference curve is also straight line, so it has one constant slope. So now if we fortunately or unfortunately, by some probability, if we get these two slopes equal, then basically the consumer will find infinite number of solutions, because then your budget constraint and the indifference curve in equilibrium will merge, right? So there will be infinite number of solutions. But if it does not happen, then either the slope of the price line or budget line is higher or lower compared to the slope of the indifference curve. So in that case, you will find a corner solution, right? So it will, the price line will intersect the indifference curve either along the x-axis or along the y-axis. So in this case, you will find the consumer to purchase either x or y. He or she cannot purchase both the commodities. Okay, so then we have another question from Subhash. Is there any difference in poor person indifference curve and the rich person indifference curve? Okay. Yes, there can be. Uh, Actually, we are assuming that we are working with a consumer, and we are assuming that we know the type of the consumer. But in our real world, actually, we have so many types of persons around, right? So basically, the preference, suppose we are still working with only two goods, x and y, but your preference for x and my preference for x can be different, right? And that will be displayed through the parameters in the utility function. So of course, when we talk about the larger society, there can be these groups of consumers, the types of consumers, and each place different level of weightage to different values, and then that can give us different shapes of utility function. Let me give you a very simple example. Suppose take the case of environment. Okay, so clean air. So the way poor people attaches value or weightage to a clean environment, and how a rich person attaches weightage or value to clean environment are different, and this has been proved empirically speaking. So of course you are right, but here for the course we are not getting into this kind of difficult situations where we are dealing with two or three or more types of consumers. We are simply dealing with one particular type of consumer. That's it. Okay, so again another question. Good. Is there any differ? No. I think I have already. Oh, it's the same question basically. Yeah. Okay. Okay. More questions, please. I am waiting. Okay. Here comes one. Consumer equilibrium and consumer surplus are they same? No, they are not same, right? So basically, okay. So let us take one particular good and let's see how we can get consumer equilibrium and the consumer surplus. So in this case, remember we have talked about the reservation price and reservation utility, that discussion at before we started the discussion on consumer surplus. So think about that diagram. So we have this demand function for a particular good, and each point on the demand function of this particular good basically gives the marginal utility that the person derives from that very unit of the good, right? That basically is the demand function. So now when we observe a fixed price P, then basically you superimpose that P in that demand function diagram, right? And then at the intersection between this flat price line and the downward sloping demand function, we find a consumer's equilibrium. So basically we say that if market price is given at P bar, then the consumer will actually purchase and consume the number of units of that consumption good, which is determined by the intersection of this flat price line and the downward sloping demand line. So that is the way to find the consumer's equilibrium in a single good model. Now, how to compute consumer surplus? So once you find that equilibrium, then basically a triangle is created, right? So there is a triangle created on the top of that price line. So if you compute the area of that triangle, that will give you the consumer surplus. I hope this is clear now. Okay, now here is a question from Rohit. Has consumer theory find application in contract theory? See, we are not teaching contract theory in this course, but I can tell you that without utility function, you cannot do analyze the behavior of consumers, right? So in contract theory, we talk about contracts between either one consumer, one producer, or two producers, or two consumers. So two individuals basically. So if you have to find out the welfare of a particular party present in contract theory, you have to talk about the consumer behavior aspect of the individual, right? So yes, they are useful. In a nutshell, if I want to answer, yes, you can find some uses, but of course contract theory is something very different. This will involve this moral hazard, adverse selection type problems, which are more advanced topics which we will not cover in the course. Okay, now here comes a question on deadweight loss in consumer surplus. Yes, Shivam, so deadweight loss actually we have not covered so far, but we are planning to cover it very soon once we are done with the theory of cost. So you are basically a question which is like for an advanced level, but anyway, I can try to help you right now if you don't want to wait. So suppose we have this market model, right, where we have a demand function and we have a supply function, and at the intersection of demand and supply, the market equilibrium level of price and market equilibrium level of quantity are determined. Now suppose for some reason, there can be many reasons. For one of these reasons, suppose the market fails to attain that equilibrium point. So then, either the market is supplying quantity which is higher than the Pareto optimal or equilibrium level of quantity, or it is under supply. So in those cases, actually deadweight loss happens, and deadweight loss basically is a sum of the producer surplus component and the consumer surplus component. So if you wait for say 10 more lectures, we are going, not even 10, I would say maybe 6 or 7 lectures, we will be discussing this deadweight loss in greater detail. And then we can have another live session. So if you are not satisfied with the explanation given in the lecture, you can again pose this question to me. Okay, another question. Decomposition of price effect. When does it happen in real life? I think there are many instances where it happens. Say the case of this, inferior good that we have discussed, and I have given you the example of inferior goods, etc. So actually, these abnormalities in consumer theory, actually they are proposed after observing things in reality. These are not like absurd ideas from armchair economists sitting in an AC room. So how can we actually utilize this price effect? That for that, I can give you one example. Suppose, you are deciding how many hours you want to work. Suppose, you have a choice to make, whether you want to work for 6 hours a day or 8 hours a day or 10 hours a day. Then basically that will depend on wage rate, right? Think about the case of overtime. This is an excellent example. So suppose there is one 8-hour regular time window where you need to work for your job, but then your boss says that, okay, I have this overtime job, so if you work for 3 hours more or 4 hours more because I need to produce more, then I will compensate for your time, and that is generally at a heavy rate, right? So then in this case, the way you decide how many hours to work for, there you can apply this tool of price decomposition. Here the price will be basically the wage rate for your labor, right? I can suggest you to look at variance intermediate microeconomics again, because they have some discussion on it. And I must say also that, this decomposition of price, that's basically some kind of, an invisible thing that is happening in the consumer's mind, right? So it's basically psychological. You don't observe a person takes a paper and pencil and then actually it computes the exact magnitude of Hick substitution effect or Slutsky substitution effect and the income effect, and then decides. No, you just observe them taking decisions. Here what we are doing, we are trying to model how a consumer decides, right? So you will never find the real life example where you can break down these components like substitution effect and income effect, and you can observe. No, that's not going to happen. Okay, we have 10 more minutes, so please ask questions. So I give you, 2 more minutes. If no question comes, then we are going to wrap up, right? So, I mean, if no question comes within 2 minutes, then I quit. Sir, why we use Hessian matrix? Okay. So Hessian matrix is used for checking the second order condition of any optimization problem, right? So if you remember your high school calculus days where you used to take derivatives with respect to only one single variable and find maxima or minima, what did you do? You first took first derivative, set that equal to 0, and that will give you the first order condition, right? And that will help you to determine the point at which maxima or minima is actually achieved. But how do you know whether you have achieved a maxima or a minima, right? So for that, basically you have to find out the second order condition. I hope you remember that much from your high school days. And then basically if we involve more than one variables, then what to do, how to check the second order conditions? For that you have to use the Hessian matrix. So I request you to go back to the basic differential calculus lecture again, where I have explained this. So Hessian is required because you have more than one variable. So you have to take double partials for more than one time, right? So how would you really show a compact result? So that is why you have to form a matrix, because there are double partials for more than one variable. Okay, any more question? If it doesn't come within 2 minutes, I'm going to quit. Okay, there is one question. Please give examples of perfectly elasticity supply goods in real world. Perfectly elastic supply for goods. Now, perfectly elastic supply means what? So basically, if there is a price change, then you can adjust your supply decision very quickly, and all of a sudden you see that there is a sudden change in the volume of the output. You are talking about supply, right? Okay, now uh, an example, it is very difficult to find an example for perfectly elastic goods in the case of demand or supply. But generally you can assume in any agricultural commodity you can think of. So if there is a small change in price, there can be no, I don't think we can talk about agricultural goods here. Mm, No, at this moment, I don't think I have a very good example to satisfy you, and they are very hard to get by. I mean, whenever we have these perfect elasticity cases for either demand or supply, it's difficult to find good examples. Any example? No, I'm just consulting my TA, and he also doesn't come up with any good answer. I fear that whether, I mean, we can find a question. I mean, an example of good which will satisfy this particular criteria. Actually, you have to, I understand what is the dilemma in your mind. You see certain things discussed in the course, and probably you are trying to always link that thing with real life objects or commodities. But I tell you one thing, don't take this course with this kind of narrow view that whatever I see in the lecture I have to find out linkages right away. There are some discussions which are theoretical. When we develop a model, when we develop a concept, we try to define it in the most general possible way, so that almost all cases can be handled. Now whether you can find different examples for different cases, that's a different question. So now I request you to take this kind of cases where you are not able to find proper example in real life as theoretical constructs. So just I suggest you to assume that these are theoretical discussions, and if you don't find a particular commodity, which you will probably not for this kind of special cases, very very special cases, then you just treat them as theoretical result and a theoretical discussion. Okay. So now there is a question from Umang. What is the use of index number in consumer theory? Well, so the index numbers like Laspere, Pache and Fisher that we have discussed, they are actually useful when you compare two different consumption bundles in two different time periods, because prices may have changed from one year to the other year or one time period to the other time period. So index number is basically used to take care of this price change, which is basically the inflation thing, and compare two consumption bundles and let consumer decide whether he was better off last year or he is better off now. So before and after price change, if the consumer wants to decide, not decide, whether consumer wants to find out whether there is some kind of welfare loss or gain, then he can use the price index numbers or quantity index numbers. Okay, we have only 2 minutes left, so I'm just asking for the last time. So if a question comes within a minute, then I am going to answer. Otherwise, almost 1 hour is over. Any question on the risk part? I have not faced any question, or you have not started listening to the lectures. The expected utility function, risk averse individual, etc. No questions on these topics? Okay, so I think let us wrap up. Oh, there's a question. In horizontal PPC, why elasticity is 0? I think I have explained this in the lecture. Why don't you, listen the lecture, please? I think we have had very good discussion, and the time is over. If I have to explain, I have to use board, and it will take at least 5-10 minutes. So I suggest you at this moment, and this is too late to ask this kind of question, I think. So I suggest you to please listen to the lecture, and if you don't understand, then we can probably address this question in the next live session. I request you to ask this kind of questions which require detailed board work, maybe at the very beginning, so that I have time, not towards the end of the live session. Okay, thank you very much for attending the live session. I hope you are kind of enjoying the course. and let's meet again. Okay, have a great day. Bye.